Welcome to Environmental Law Explored, a podcast series, the podcast of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. SEER is a member organization whose mission is to foster the success of a diverse community of environmental, energy, and resources lawyers, advisors, law students, and decision makers, and provide a premier forum for the exchange of ideas and information.
Hello, and welcome to our third episode of our podcast series focused on microplastics. In our first two episodes, we focused in on what the basics and fundamentals of microplastics are in terms of what are they and where are they found. And then today, on our third episode, we're going to turn to the science of microplastics and really focus in on how do you sample for them, how do you analyze them, what is the state of the science and the technology today, and where will it be heading in the future. We're fortunate to have two great panelists with us to talk us through those issues. Andrew Patterson and Rachel Maxwell are both scientists who have spent a number of years working on these issues and are going to be able to walk us through sort of what they do on a daily basis, but also where they see this issue moving forward in the future. And so why don't we start a little bit by having Andrew and Rachel please introduce yourselves.
Sounds good. I'll go first. So my name is Rachel Maxwell, and I am a senior scientist with an environmental consulting firm called Roux Associates out of their Oakland, California office. And I have been working with Roux for almost 9 years now. And before Roux, I attended the University of Arizona, where I got my master's in soil and water science and my bachelor's in environmental chemistry. And during my time there, I worked at the Arizona Laboratory for Emerging Contaminants. And so kind of had a little bit of a lab background and then made a switch to environmental consulting and have been doing that ever since.
And my name is Andrew Patterson. I'm the technical director for Eurofins Environment. My home base is in Sacramento, California, but I tend to work at whatever labs need me at the time. So I used to travel pre-COVID a lot more to Lancaster and Knoxville and Denver and wherever I need to go. We define specialty services as anything needing a high resolution sector instrument for legacy pops such as PCBs or dioxins. And then the other half of my brain is predominated by all things PFAS on the LCMS side of things, but also emerging contaminants. I recently got to work on 6-ppd-quinone, the tire anti-ozonate. And our same group is also spearheading the microplastic effort. All that work is being done in West Sacramento. I've been with Eurofins only since 2019, and I really do enjoy it. But I've been in the environmental industry for over 20 years now. So this is exciting to work on. I get really excited about new things and how I can help out, and I'm happy to be a part of it.
Well, great, and thank you to both of you for spending your time with us today and working on these issues. You know, one of the things that we like to ask each of our panelists throughout this program is going to be sort of what microplastics means to you. I just want to start with a simple question to each of you. You know, when I say microplastics, you think of what?
Rachel, you go first.
There's a lot of things that I think about when I think about microplastics. I mean, to start, there are plastics that are made to be already very, very tiny. And I like to think of them from what I can see with my eye. So anything from the size of an eraser head all the way down to actually what you can't see with the human eye. And they can range in shapes and sizes and what they're made out of, so the types of plastics that they are. But they also can just be larger plastics that have broken down into smaller pieces. Those would be what we call secondary microplastics. But you know, it's a human-made contaminant we have put into the environment, and there are a lot of them, and they're probably going to be around for a while. So they're kind of just like these nasty little particles that have essentially made their way into our world.
I think I share some of your same definitions there, but you know, and I'd say because we are a lab and we like to put metrics on things, that you know, we define microplastics as any microplastic. Any plastic that's between 1 micrometer and 5 millimeters, which sounds really big. 5 millimeters is Something you could pick up, 1 millimeter is something you could pick up, but really, the rubber meets the road because there's a lot of real estate in between, say, 100 micrometers and 1 micrometer. And so really from like a lab's perspective, we are looking, and our clients are interested in those truly microplastics. There is no such thing as zero. And so below microplastics, and we're not going to cover it here, are nanoplastics. So that's orders of magnitude smaller even than a microplastic. But most of the time we're talking about secondary microplastics, where these are unintentionally in the environment. But we'll be covering it later, where things like cosmetics have primary microplastics. Those are microplastics that are intentionally added into products to have some desirable characteristics, at least at the beginning. It's the Wild West.
Can you give us, for those of us who don't know sort of, what 1 micrometer might look like, are we talking something about the size of a human hair? Are we talking something larger, smaller? Is there a reference point for folks?
These can be larger or smaller than human hair. I think a human hair is about 0.05 millimeter, or about 50 micrometers on the smaller side of things. So yes, this is in that range, but smaller or larger.
And so I imagine that makes it pretty hard to sample for these things in the environment. The diversity and the size differences and the origination, where they originated from. Tell us a little bit about sort of the state of sampling and what that looks like today.
So the sampling, it can either be, if you don't have a very dense population of microplastics, you're going to need to collect more volume to have a concentrative effect. At the end of the day, we really just want representative samples. So there could be scenarios where we don't need to concentrate that much volume. We may need to dilute volume, because we want to end up with a representative sample, but also a reasonable amount of particles that we can count in a fixed time. A standard, kind of a reference standard slide should have about 200 particles on it, and that takes about an hour to count. So if you can kind of think that if I have about 200 particles, that's going to be an hour of instrument time or person time. And that kind of goes to the other part of the scheme, where if people are used to a chemical analysis where you have a calibration range, you might have particles that you're counting on the larger side by hand before you can generate a compositional report. And then you might have particles that you just can't see, and you're relying on the instrument to count. So really you're crossing a wide swath of dimensions here that have to be taken into consideration to get that representative, comprehensive picture.
And then a couple things that I just wanted to chime in on sampling microplastics is I just wanted to make everyone aware that the methods that are being developed to sample microplastics are constantly changing and evolving. So we don't even really have what we're considering like standard validated EPA methods for all the different major seeds that microplastics could exist in. In California, we're starting with drinking water, and Andrew will talk about that more later, but we're pretty much there for the sampling and analysis of microplastics. But there are so many other medias that we haven't been able to dive into as much. Wastewater, industrial, discharge, stormwater, personal care products, food, even though there are a number of like academic labs and other commercial labs that have developed their own methods, we don't have essentially EPA or ASTM standardized methods for those other matrices. So it's definitely an evolving and changing task that everyone is working on. That makes things quite difficult.
Rachel, you mentioned drinking water, and of course that's a primary concern to people across the country. They always wonder whether or not their drinking water is safe and whether things like PFAS or microplastics are in their drinking water. Andrew, I know being based in California is often a leader on environmental regulation, and they are here as well. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in the state of California and where the drinking water sampling and analysis science stands?
You bet. The elephant in the room is California Senate Bill 1422. The first really true microplastics bill that gives some bite to the whole topic. And really that's the matrices that I think we're gonna primarily focus on out of the gates. We're building a microplastic lab in West Sacramento. And our first matrices that we're going to get validated for is drinking water. And we do have dedicated drinking water labs, and we're going to be adding capacity as we go on. But really, it's a way to sort of dip our toe into the water, so to speak, before we dive in with something like effluent. We know there's going to be a lot of focus on secondary and tertiary effluents, but really for drinking water, we're also, when we say drinking water, it could be both municipal sources or bottled sources. Beverages are going to be a thing. And Rachel and I were talking just the other day. If you had, say, sparkling water, are there microplastics in that sparkling water before you open it? The source water, did it happen during bottling? And then there have been reports showing that when you open that container, that you're actually introducing a variable amount of microplastics into that bottle. So it's sort of a chicken and the egg kind of conversation sometimes with beverages, but there should be, and there is, a focus on drinking water because we know that microplastics can concentrate in human tissues. There was an Italian study that came out showing microplastics in placental tissue, which we know how long the placenta was there. And so it is kind of scary to say that these are building up in your body in a short period of time. And that's I think drinking water is on the tip of everyone's tongues.
So as Andrew was mentioning, this Senate Bill 1422 in California, it essentially laid out all these, I like to call them like big bullet points that California needs to establish as part of it when it comes to microplastics in drinking water. Step one was just coming up with a definition of what California decided microplastics were going to be in drinking water. And Andrew mentioned that earlier. It's from 1 micron to 5 millimeters in size. There's some other caveats involved too, like it has to be 3-dimensional, certain things like that. But the other things that were in that Senate bill as well was that California needed to establish a 4-year sampling plan for sampling microplastics in drinking water. This was supposed to already have been done, but because of the pandemic, of course, things are quite delayed. But I foresee it probably happening sometime in 2023. I remember correctly, I think any facility that serves over 100,000 individuals within the state of California will be receiving an order to analyze their drinking water source for microplastics. So that's kind of going to be a big front that's going to be happening within the state of California pretty soon. And they're the first state in the US that has essentially adopted this. So they're kind of leading the nation on this front.
And as we've seen in so many other instances, as California leads, other states generally will follow. So it's something where we can expect this to be something similar, if not the same, to be coming in other states as well, of course. You know, Andrew, you mentioned that Eurofins was building a microplastics lab. Is there capacity today for someone, if they wanted to go analyze their source water, if they wanted to analyze their products, is there capacity out there? Is the technical, availability out there for labs, or is it something where there's just not somewhere that you could turn to easily? And if you can turn to somebody, is it going to be affordable?
There's a lot in that question. Let's just start with capacity. Part of the reason that we're getting into this is we have colleagues both in Europe and Australia that are already performing microplastic analyses. In Europe, we have a lab that's really great, GC pyrolysis. And down in Australia, they primarily use LDIR. And so we've actually been sending our samples out to these other places because the labs, the academic labs, are what predominates the US. And those have, I've heard, those have up to a year turnaround time. So if you wanted to get some quick data, that's just not an option unless you're sending it out overseas. We hope to increase that capacity, and we are going to be serving both consultants and we haven't really talked about if an average consumer can send in their water samples. We do that for PFAS, and we do that for some of the other analyses we have, where if you do want to pay for those services, that we should provide that, and I think we should. There's a lot of NGOs out there. There's a lot of people that just want to know, and in fact, we are getting hits on our website. Concerned citizens or townships that just want to look into this. And so, I applaud people for being proactive on this issue. Again, every conversation leads back to PFAS, and we're seeing a lot of parallels between PFAS and between microplastics. On the affordability side, we're really still talking about what prices to expect. We do have some prices from our Australian colleagues, and I can say that nothing's looking too cheap. The reason really for that is that these instruments, they're expensive as a triple quad that you'd perform a PFAS on. They're a couple $100,000 per instrument. And then, one thing we'll talk about later is just this analysis time. A PFAS analysis takes maybe 10 or 15 minutes. A microplastic analysis can take 2 to 3 hours. That's not even including, depending on the matrix, that you may have a digestion step or multiple digestion steps that take 1 to 2 days. So really, when it comes down to it, this is a very labor-intensive and really manual process to get good data. And so that comes with a price, but like everything else, you get what you pay for. I wouldn't be seeking out discount eye surgery, and I would also not be seeking out bargain basement microplastic or PFAS analysis.
I think you'd be wise that in that choice, sometimes when new technology comes around, it will be expensive and it will be labor intensive, at least at the outset. I want to go back to something that Rachel mentioned earlier, which was that, outside the drinking water context, there really aren't well-developed or developing methodologies to analyze these samples. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means for entities? One of the most challenging things I think that my clients find is when EPA or the public or their investors or owners expect them to be able to do something, to know something about their products and the environmental impact that they have, but the technology isn't there to help them understand those things. Can you talk a little bit about sort of where things stand outside of the drinking water context? And is there anything companies or townships or whomever can be doing in that context or those contexts?
For sure. I would say probably the biggest group that has come together to understand how to sample these other matrices for microplastics is just last month, the ITRC just drafted their draft guidance for microplastics. So it's essentially this working group that has minds from consulting firms, labs, academic entities, state regulators are coming together and essentially doing a huge literary review to understand what information is available out there regarding microplastics and identifying all the potential data gaps. As part of the guidance, they did include an appendix that essentially summarizes all the methods that they were able to find when it comes to analyzing these other matrices for microplastics. But that being said, even though there are methods that have been established because they're not validated or standardized, that means that, say, I were to collect a sample for microplastics in a personal care product, and Andrew were to sample a personal care products for microplastics. We're not following the same method when it comes to sampling and analyzing that sample. We could have different results to one another, which means we wouldn't be able to compare our samples apples to apples. That being said, I'm sure we would get pretty similar results, but you can run into issues where you may not be having, certified labs doing these analyses using certified methodologies, which isn't a great way to fully understand or grasp essentially how much microplastics could be in these other matrices and in the environment. That's why it's really important to have, the perfect example, we talked about PFAS a lot as well. It's kind of a good surrogate for understanding where the future of microplastics could potentially go. PFAS also had a huge issue with technology not being up to date when we wanted to understand how much of it was in the environment. And in many ways, we're still tackling that. And we're still fully understanding that. And so we're going to run into a lot of the similar issues with microplastics.
That's a great parallel, Rachel. And having built a PFAS lab in the mid-2000s, we look back on some of that work and kind of with a chuckle, where we were doing just PFAS and PFOA. And it seemed, really rudimentary compared to what we can do now and the level of sophistication. But at the time, that was advanced. And I think that's okay. With microplastics, where are we at right now? We've had a lot of academic papers come out saying, hey, these are really ubiquitous. Everywhere we look, we find microplastics. And so if, this early phase is not only Let's start delineating it, but how do we delineate it? And with what technology and to what size? That's something we'll get into, but I think it's okay to not have the ultimate sophistication right out of the gates, but to fumble through it. I like to think that the first couple telephone calls might have had a lot of static, but they were still a telephone call. So that's okay. And we know that going in, and we're going to get better with every project that we tackle.
And we'll talk in future episodes about sort of the regulatory landscape as it applies to microplastics, because one of the challenges can be when that landscape is demanding something beyond where the science is really at the moment. And what do you do with those people who went first through the gate, maybe made choices about how big the sample size would be or something like that, only to have the regulatory agency say, no, should have been twice that size or half that size or the like. So the regulatory overlay can always be a challenge, at least I know from my clients. We've talked a little bit about where things stand today. Where do you see this heading in the near future? When will your lab Eurofins Lab be up and running, Andrew? And where do you see us moving in the next year or two as we close out our conversation today?
Well, the ITRC documents that Rachel just mentioned that were published.
Andrew, could you please remind us what ITRC stands for?
You bet. It's the Interstate Technology and Regulatory Council.
Thank you.
If you actually look at that document, the picture of the lab with its engineer controls, that's actually our lab when it was under construction. We really hope to be, we're going to start a queue. Like we're talking about this as we speak. We're going to start a queue because we have people lining up that want to submit samples. And we hope to be, it's the middle of July right now. We hope to be up by the end of August accepting samples after we get visits from our auditors and everything else like that. We're going to start with drinking water and beverages. And then you asked, where's this going? We have people asking us about effluents. We're going to be looking at effluents. We have industrial clients that know they likely have microplastic constituents in their discharges. So we're going to be looking at industrial clients. And then we actually do have clients, some similar PFAS clients in the cosmetics industry, and those would be looking at primary microplastics. We're looking for these intentionally added plastics. So we are going to be supporting primary and secondary microplastics, secondary starting with drinking water and moving on from there. We know that tissues will be a great monitoring tool. Again, back to our Australian colleagues, they do a lot of bivalve work. That's going to be key for us as well. Those involve more aggressive digestion steps, as Rachel was getting at, that those methods are still being refined. And we know they're being refined by the people, the experts. So we're along kind of for the ride with some of these other matrices. Drinking water is not going to change a whole lot, but others will. It's no accident that you have an analytical laboratory paired up with a consulting firm on this podcast. And I do see that as a really strong path forward. Whereas more and more consultants get into the microplastic field, that they're going to need labs to support them. This scenario has been going on for decades, and it seems to work pretty well. Everybody focuses on what they're good at. The job of the analytical laboratory, no matter if it's a chemical or physical analysis, is to deliver data with confidence that we can stand behind, and the consulting firms are the ones that apply the models and that do the data interpretation. And so that's, I think, what you're going to see going forward.
I think something else that I wanted to add on is we're talking about microplastics being the contaminant themselves in the environment, but there's a whole other area of looking at microplastics as vectors of other contaminants as well. So essentially microplastics in the environment have these really strong hydrophobic surfaces, meaning that they're going to essentially absorb all other contaminants that are like them. And so now you've created this issue where, say you have an oil spill in soil, that oil is going to want to absorb onto the microplastics that are in the soil. So now you've created essentially this physical item that now has contamination all around it that is going to be transporting in the environment. And that could make it more difficult to remediate. All those studies are still being done on if you have microplastics in the environment and contaminants are absorbed to them, does it make it easier or more difficult to remediate when you start to think about environmental cleanup? And how that relationship works could depend on what contaminant is released into the environment. So like hydrocarbons are gonna behave differently than, PCBs absorbed to microplastic surfaces. And then what happens when animals eat those microplastics that have potential contaminants on them? So there's just like a whole host of essentially ideas and issues that, the scientific community is pretty much just beginning to scratch at the surface to fully understand this. And again, as Andrew mentioned, that's not really a bad thing. The fact that we're finally starting to move forward and understand these issues collectively as a community is a wonderful place to start.
That's my favorite topic, Rachel, because I had an internal presentation with Eurofins and I said, did you know we're already studying microplastics? We're already looking at microplastics. And everyone said, well, I don't quite think so. I said, no, when we get samples in, those have microplastics in them. And when we extract for like a PCB aqueous sample with dichloromethane, we're extracting something. If there are microplastics there, we're extracting some compounds off those microplastics already. For a PFAS analysis, one of the most important steps in the extraction process is to rinse the polypropylene or HDPE bottle with methanol, with basic methanol. And that's to desorb any PFAS that are stuck to that plastic. We do a lot of work with passive samplers. Where a very popular passive sampling media is polyethylene. That's plastic. That's the same stuff that's used as drop cloths for painters and whatnot. We know those like as Rachel said, we know those pick up PCBs, and in fact, we count on them picking up PCBs at a known rate depending on the hydrophobicity of that PCB. So it's going to be picking up shorter, or like PCB 14, a lot less than a more hydrophobic Nona or Deca PCB, something like PCB 204. We count sometimes on these contaminants sorbing to these plastics. And so now we're here dealing with the plastics themselves.
It's a fascinating sort of offshoot of the conversation today. Sort of the ability to analyze and sample for these microplastics is really just the tip of the iceberg. And there's so much more to understand about their role in the environment once we find them where they are in the environment. I want to thank you both for your time today. I want to give you one last question as we end. What would be the one thing that you'd ask people to take away and remember from our conversation today?
I guess I will go first. I think it's just important to note that even though we, are trying to understand how microplastics behave in the environment, it should be important to note that, they've been here for a while. So how they have been impacting, the various modeling that we've done, the community has done regarding how contaminants behave in the environment. Those studies have probably included microplastics in one form or another, whether we were individually calling them out as microplastics or not. And then the other thing that I would say is, as we've mentioned, this is still a fairly new field within environmental consulting, within, the laboratory world as well, is just understanding how we are going to sample and analyze, this contaminant and what that means for the future. So I foresee it being a continually evolving and changing topic, and I'm really excited to see where it goes into the future.
And I think we didn't even really get to talk too much about the technology involved in looking at these microplastics, which right now are two common technologies that are being refined. One's Raman spectroscopy, and the other one is IR, infrared, whether it be FTIR or LDIR. And I know I just threw out a bunch of acronyms and everyone hates that, but the technology is evolving along with the regulations. And so I would ask people to be patient as we roll out matrices, but also to be vocal. One thing I don't know that everyone realizes is we have our ears wide open. And so if there are cities or municipalities or anything else, please ask your analytical lab. If it's not us, if it's somebody else, no matter what it is. If it's for next PFAS analysis, if it's for microplastics, it's for something you haven't seen out there in microplastics yet, ask. We have armies of people just waiting to answer questions or as best we can. And if we get asked the same question multiple times, we'll know to look into it. We'll know to try to bring that facet online. So just just be vocal. We're here. We want to hear about it.
All right. Well, thank you very much again for your time today. Our guests have been Rachel Maxwell from Roux Associates and Andrew Patterson from Eurofins. I really appreciate your time and the discussion. I know I've learned a lot. I hope our audience has learned a lot. Our next session will be on ecological risks in the current state of ecotoxicology and understanding the ecotoxicology of microplastics. And we look forward to that conversation. But for today, that concludes our program. And thank you to Rachel and Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. To learn more about our section, please visit our website at www.americanbar.org/enviro. Please check where you found us for future episodes. Thank you for listening.